Welcome to the Unfazed, Unedited podcast, where we provide commentary on complicated topics in an uncomplicated format. I'm Dr. Shaunna Payne Gold, and I go by she, her, hers pronouns. And Dr. Lisa, here we are back at the mic, giving folks some updates and going into new places and spaces. But how are you doing? How is the weather and what's going on in your area?
Well, I am currently in sunny Dallas, although now it's nighttime. As you can see, my lovely hotel
Oh,
headboard behind me.
well,
So,
what's the temperature there? What's the temperature? Because it's
88
usually warm.
degrees. 88.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was a bit
Wh-
windy, but it's 88. Yeah, and so I'm
Oh,
pretty happy about that.
I was gonna say because it's 47 here, and I've got to go
Woo!
back in a little bit, a couple weeks, and so I guess I need to check to make sure how to pack for a couple of nights there because yeah, completely different here in Maryland. So, oh, okay, I'll check the weather before packing my bags here. But so, Lisa, you and I we had a small fit around folks being called back to work. And I want to give an update in regards to some folks who are thinking on the same wavelength that we're thinking on,
Awesome.
Lisa.
Awesome.
So, Spotify, and side note, if you have not subscribed to us on Spotify, go do that right now, right now, right now. But Spotify, kudos to them for basically going completely against our Amazon and Dell report a few episodes ago that they will maintain their remote work policy. And I loved that their CEO said that they trust their workers. They trust them to be productive, they trust them to get the job done, and they said, quote, they aren't children. That just made me giddy inside, Lisa. So somebody is thinking the same way we're thinking.
Yep. Yep. I love it. Good for you, Spotify. Keeping it real there.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So we could go on and on about that one. But anyway, but yeah, kudos to Spotify and go subscribe to us on Spotify if you're not already there yet, just in case you're in between places and spaces and want to listen. But let's dive into our word of the week. And Lisa, this word was on my fifth grader's spelling list this week. The word indigenous. Indigenous. And you and I, we obviously bring up these populations from time to time, and we kind of bring the word up without defining
Mm-hmm.
it. Once again,
Mm-hmm.
making the assumption that people know what it means. And indigenous means, at least from a fifth grade definition, from what Kendrick knows, indigenous is originating or occurring naturally in a particular place. And I thought that was interesting because I had never thought about, well, let me take that back. I have thought about things being indigenous, but I
Mm-hmm.
usually first
Mm-hmm.
think of people being
Yeah.
indigenous. So, let's say, for example, an indigenous plant or something that is food that is indigenous to a particular area. I usually think of people first. And so I
Mm-hmm.
appreciate that these additional definitions to remind us that people, places, things uh, can certainly fit the bill of being indigenous.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it's timely as well.
Yes. So we also had, um, so we have Thanksgiving coming up in the United States, obviously, and that
Mm-hmm.
is, or the mainstream narrative there is one where Native Americans, Indigenous Americans, and
Mm-hmm.
European settlers were, having a happy dinner together, to give thanks. And you scratch at that, and it's not exactly accurate there. And then
Mm-mm.
obviously
Mm-mm.
we just had Columbus Day here in the United States that honors
Mm-hmm.
Christopher Columbus, but has been renamed Indigenous Peoples Day or First Peoples Day or Native American Day. So it's
Mm-hmm.
definitely timely to define that word, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So think about indigenous populations and even Lisa, I know this kind of ties back into a few episodes ago when we talked about the uh, libraries that are book sanctuaries. And I noticed the library that I walk into all the time had a land acknowledgement on its wall that I pass by all the time going to the restroom. And I finally noticed this placard there and talking about the listing of all the Native American tribes and indigenous folks, as well as the resources that are around the library that used to be around the library. So I think it's important for us to just pay attention because it's around us much more than we may pay attention to. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, let's get into phase one. Phase one. And I thought it was really interesting to bring up because, of course, I get lots of ideas from lots of different social media platforms, whether it's LinkedIn or Instagram or wherever it may be. And I thought it was really important for us to think about this phase on humor in particular. And I love to laugh, y'all. I mean, I especially love to learn about, follow, support new comedians that are out on the road, even before they become a big name. I even recall sitting with some of my former students that used to live in my residence hall where I was a hall director, and we were flipping through a photo album, and we realized that one of the events that was on campus that year happened to be Kevin Hart in their dining hall before he was Kevin Hart, right? And so, I started to reflect on how many comedians I've followed over the years and even looking at the history of comedy. But there are some times where people like to hide. Look, we're just going to be explicit. People like to hide shit in the sugar, y'all, for real. It happens sometimes when it comes to humor. And so I really appreciated a post that I believe was on Instagram that talked about how racist and sexist perspectives, even tropes, can be couched in humor in such a way that if you're not paying attention or if you're taken off guard, it can be hidden in the ha 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 of the reality of what people think of particular groups. Now, how this applies was that before the election on October 27th, the former president, 45, I can't even bring myself to say his name, but he had several speakers ahead of his rally in Madison Square Garden where they did exactly this. They used racist terms, sexist terms, misogynistic ideas, and couched them in ha 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 humor. So, for example, calling Puerto Rico a pile of trash floating in the ocean, for example, or referring to Travis Kelce, who is a white male from Cleveland Heights, Ohio, as the next O.J. Simpson, which obviously is not white and male and from Cleveland Heights, Ohio. Yeah, it just, I don't know, Lisa. I think, as I've said often in trainings, when it comes to humor and some of these ist terms and sentiments, comedians are only funny when they have an audience. And so I just try to be mindful of when I'm giving this type of language and this type of couched humor, being aware of when I'm giving it a platform, a stage, an audience. Whether it's by responding, non-verbally or verbally or however I'm responding, am I giving it an audience? Because it's not funny unless someone laughs. And so sometimes we have to check ourselves if we're laughing or not. It very much reminds me of before Dave Chappelle left the Chappelle show, left a lot of money on the table. And he said, as I was making my jokes and having my skits shared with the world, I noticed that some white folks were laughing a little bit too hard. And so I stopped giving them a platform because that's not the direction my humor was supposed to go in. And so, Lisa, I wonder, what you think about humor. I think you have a great sense of humor. And so with that, I'm just wondering how these types of things can land on you, given that American humor has a specific history. And once again, this is America. So, what do you think?
Mm. Yeah, I've never loved stand up and what is it called when you have a bunch of comedians and they improvisation.
Yes,
I've
yes.
I've never loved that because I feel like I'm always standing on this precipice of is it going to drop into racism and sexism and homophobia and ableism, right? Um, so I've always just felt very tense in those moments. I just don't tend to go see stand up, and in particular, I don't tend to go see improvisation because of that very reason. Um, that's not just an American thing. I just have always felt that way about it. But with the Travis Kelsey thing and OJ, what people laughed at there, was well, it hit home to the work that I do, right? Because obviously OJ Simpson was accused of murdering his wife and her partner, right? And so this idea that Travis Kelsey is going to murder in an act of domestic violence Taylor Swift. And so to your point around there has to be an audience for that. That was like, so the comment about Puerto Rico was just an explicitly racist Puerto Rico is a pile of trash comment, right? Like there's not really a lot of explaining needed there. Obviously it got laughter. The Taylor Swift and Travis Kelsey one, it was indirect, but there were people that laughed at it. So there were people that got the message that he was making a joke about the potentiality of him murdering Taylor Swift in a domestic violence incident. That's funny, right? So that chills me a little bit, Shauna, because it wasn't even an explicit joke, but there were people that read between the lines and still laughed and thought that was funny, right? Like, so I just don't do well with comedy because I just always feel like we are 4 seconds away from something really awful that I'm going to have to get up and walk out on. So I just don't go, you know?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it feels a lot like when people say, I'm not racist, but and then they like move into this like story or narrative is clearly
Oh yeah.
racist and you
Oh
obviously
yeah.
wouldn't need to preface it with I'm not racist unless you thought that perhaps what you were going to say was racist. So it's not the same device, but it feels similar, right? I'm going to make a joke about this thing so I can slide in my racist and sexist comments without being held accountable, and then I just accuse Shauna of being too sensitive or she just doesn't get it, right?
Yeah, she doesn't have a sense of humor, so I can just
Yeah.
it's a great it's a great way again to try to put this camouflage over language, thoughts that no, they're not okay. And I'm not going to entertain them. And yeah, I love comedy. And at the same time, I also have to remember that you and I come from a different history of comedy because historically, especially when you're talking about Black and brown comedians, um, it has been used as a how can I say, a response. Let me put it that way, a response to some of those challenges. So, for example, the laundry list of comedians that would not be able to do a stand up for 5 minutes in our current climate, because even though they were talking about their own stories, they were talking about the challenges of their lived experience. Mm-mm, that stuff would not fly right now. Some of the even if we stripped some of that comedy of the slur terms that were used that frankly I can't even listen to for 5 seconds now, even if we stripped all of that, the concepts and the ideas would be considered offensive to most, especially if they don't consider it as in response to other forms of humor, right? So, whether it's, the history of Dick Gregory or Richard Pryor or Lenny Bruce or, some of those Black male comedians where we have a very long standing history of being responsive to social justice issues, and they use their comedy to do that. It's a little bit different if you instigate versus if you respond. And I'm not making any of those
Yeah, yeah.
comedians out to be perfect. I'm not saying that at all, but it's kind of like, do you blame someone for punching back if they got punched first with comedy? I think it bears a
Mm.
consideration of what's your starting point when it comes to what's funny and what's not.
Yeah, I think that's an important context. I mean, obviously that is not what the speakers prior to 45's
Mm-hmm.
rally were, right? Or maybe they
Mm-hmm.
maybe or maybe actually, given how warped their thinking is, maybe they did feel like they were punching back with comedy because they'd been punched first, right? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I don't
Mm-hmm.
know. I mean, it's bullshit, obviously, but it's curious the ways in which white people, especially, can manipulate and twist reality to suit their articulation of a particular position, right? So I would be curious to see what the thought process was around that, whether, or if there probably wasn't much of a thought. I'm probably giving them too much credit. That is probably what Lisa is doing right now, giving them too much credit, which is very different from what you're saying around comedy as a tool of social justice and resistance, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And the comedy of what I was listening to earlier today around it's laughable to assume that people of color, women, LGBT folks, people with disabilities, it's laughable to that those that don't fit in those categories assume that they can manipulate those groups. Like we see exactly who you are and what you're doing, and it's laughable that you assume that we're beneath you or not competent enough to understand exactly the injustice that's going on. Like that to
Right.
me is
Right.
is quite ridiculous. And so I think that's part of the fighting back is that it's laughable. And there
Mm-hmm.
is some truth to the laugh to keep from crying phrase
Yeah.
that, it is a salve for lots of
Mm-hmm.
pain.
Mm-hmm.
If we true like I think about I forget whose quote it was, but it said it's almost impossible for a marginalized person in this context, in this American context, not to have some type of trauma, not to have
Right.
some type of
Right.
um, uh, limitation and harm in such a way that how do you cope? What is your coping mechanism? And so when I think about that laugh therapy piece, there's sometimes where you do have to laugh because it's just ridiculous. Like, isn't it ridiculous? I remember when Trey was first trying to understand the concept of race and racism. And he just thought it was the funniest thing ever that somebody assigned intelligence and worth based on how tan you were. He used to say how tan you were at the time. Like, mommy, isn't that ridiculous? Somebody said that we weren't as smart as they are because our tan is better. He used to think that was the funniest thing ever, right? And it is almost ridiculous until, unlike a pre K kid, until you understand how that works in day to day life. The thought of it is ridiculous. The playing out of it in day to day life to the point of life and death is a different matter that lacks any humor. So, given that, how do you cope with it from day to day? Laughter ends up being the option or one of the options to cope. Because if not,
Yeah.
if I didn't get to
Yeah.
laugh every day, I'm not quite sure if I would be able to cope without some form of laughter and acknowledging the
Mm-hmm.
ridiculousness of the life that we call being Black and American, being a woman and American, being fill in the blank and American.
Yeah, so there's like these, you're highlighting kind of these multiple strands, right? You've got white people, men, people with other types of identity privilege
Mm-hmm.
integrating into their comic performances derogatory, demeaning,
Mm-hmm.
racial gender stereotypes, whatever it may be, right? And tapping into that kind of like undercurrent of racism, sexism, or whatever in society. You've then got comedy as a salve, as you said, to reduce the trauma of being black in America, being a woman in America, right? And then you've also got this third strand of then using comedy and humor as a tool of resistance and social justice to push back against these larger narratives that are destructive and harmful. So it's
Mm-hmm.
like there's like these three ways that comedy is being utilized all at the same time,
Mm-hmm.
to maintain power and resist power and survive power, right?
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. And in some ways thrive in power, because as we laugh through the ridiculousness of this life, also thinking about, wow, and we still, it truly is that analogy of a rose growing through concrete. It's like, and we still rise, and we still maintain, and we still grow, and we still do all these things. And so, even as an entire system is created to make sure that you don't exist, you in fact do. And not only do you exist, you thrive in that. And so that's what's laughable, is that, ha, you thought you had us, you actually don't. And not making light of it, but soothing it for sure. That's a
Yeah.
challenge. I mean, I think comedians have a very hard job, especially if you're speaking to these populations that have a disproportionate level of pain.
Yeah.
That's a hard job.
Yeah. Or I think this guy that was at Trump's rally particularly had a hard job. He just went for the easy
Oh,
laughs,
for
right? Yeah.
sure. For sure. Oh, absolutely.
Total
Absolutely.
fucking asshole. Yeah. All right. Well, lots to think about there and how comedy is used and abused.
Mm-hmm.
So what about phase two? What's the next topic of discussion?
Oh, it's always something good. So, if folks remember a few episodes ago, we did talk about the United States rarely, I'm talking about super rarely, if ever, apologizing for anything. And so I think we rattled off a list of, I believe, 5 apologies, and we're now up to 6. Woohoo! We're up to 6 apologies now. Um, but in late October, President Biden formally apologized for the 150-year-old Indian boarding school policy. And he said, quote, "I formally apologize as President of the United States of America for what we did. It's long overdue. The federal Indian boarding school policy, the pain it caused, will always be a significant mark of shame, a blot on American history," end quote. And so basically, this apology is coming on the heels of an investigation that was led by Deb Haaland, who's the first Native American Secretary of the Interior, where she looked at what really occurred with those boarding schools, which included the deaths of at least 973 children at the boarding school. Physical and sexual abuse occurred, forced separation of families, name changes. This is sounding real familiar to Blackness, I'm just saying. Haircuts, forced assimilation into white culture, Christian religion. What I think is appropriate is the apology. And at the same time, I recognize how similarly, not the same, but similarly to those that heard um, the apology in regards to slavery in this country by President Obama, there are going to be gradients of individuals' responses to this apology. Whether it's utter bullshit and you wasted your breath saying it, from that end of the spectrum all the way to thank you so much, I'm good, we're going to keep moving forward. I am of the camp, similarly to the apology for the institution of slavery and stopping short of reparations. I too feel that, oh, this is interesting and also incomplete. Meaning that, as I always say, my grandmother says it all the time, the best apology is changed behavior. How is the treatment of our Native American siblings going to change, adjust, or make up for the bullshit of this many years? And I don't see that now. I've only done a cursory look at the formal apology, but I'm like, okay, where's the plan that comes along with the apology? Like, where is it?
Right,
Is it
right.
there? Where is it? So I don't know, Lisa. I am certainly of the camp of apologies need to come with something. Like all this posturing and formal language that is etched into posterity, are people going to look back and be like, oh, that was hollow?
Yeah, I think that it's not unimportant, but it doesn't go far enough, right? And that it was 2024 that this happened. So Deb Haaland is not only the first Native American Secretary of the Interior, I believe she's the very first Native American Cabinet Secretary, so of any department, which is shocking, really, right? When you think about how this land was stolen from them, from Indigenous people, Native American people, and that the ways in which our government has kind of treated them and their sovereignty. And interestingly, Shaunna, some time ago, we talked on this podcast about the Indian Child Welfare Act, I believe, because a few years ago it was under threat from a white couple or a handful of white couples who were challenging its legitimacy because they believed it to be racist, or at least maybe not the term racist, but racial discrimination against them, because the act created a preference to house Native children with their family or kind of the larger Native community if there was not a family available. And these white families were fostering and they wanted to adopt, right? And the act prevented that from happening. So when you situate that act in this larger history of forced removal and the erasure of native traditions and histories and language and the stolen land, and this challenge came up to the Supreme Court 21, 22, so not that long ago. And then you think, okay, so Biden is now apologizing for the boarding policy, but not 3 years ago we had this pretty risky situation where this whole federal law that was intended to try and turn back the clock on some of those forced removals was going to potentially be found to be unconstitutional, right? Like it's very lopsided. And so it just worries me that words are hollow, to your grandmother's point, if there's no action behind them. And so land has still been stolen, right?
Mm-hmm.
Generational trauma still exists. Racism is still experienced. And what's being done there to right those wrongs, right?
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, and when I think about more recently, this was, gosh, a few months ago, I finally sat down and watched the Leonardo DiCaprio movie, Killers of the Flower Moon. And thinking about that movie, if you haven't seen it, you should go see it. It's uh, situated in the 1920s, when the Osage Nation land was pretty much uh, being targeted because of the oil that was there. And so you have an entire nation that was thriving, and white folks befriended them, sometimes married them. Uh, at that at that time, a lot of folks, natives, were suffering with diabetes, and they were not being treated, or they were being treated with placebos, only for the white husbands to wait for them to die to take over their oil. Shit like that. And what I think is important about those stories, and reminding us of those stories, is that isn't it interesting how stuff is going real good until folks are disturbed, until folks are disrespected, until folks take over, until all of a sudden what is native and minding their own business now, all of a sudden white folks decide that they have a right to something. It just is mind boggling, the thought that any group decides that it just will have dominion over any other group and its resources. It just continues to boggle my mind. And so, with that, again, we have another group of folks who deserve to be made whole. They deserve to be restored. And, if this is a presidential apology that is posturing, we'll find out. If we look back in 10 years and we find out that this country has done nothing to make that right, that's going to be very telling.
Yeah, I mean, my guess is that's what we'll find in 10 years. I mean, and he was apologizing specifically for the boarding school policy, right? He wasn't apologizing for genocide that occurred when European settlers came over here and um, decided to forcibly take the land, right? So he was just apologizing for this one heinous and devastating policy, but there's a lot more, right? There is a lot more that white Americans, or I guess really, I mean, at the time, it would have been white English people, Scottish people, Irish people, other European people, right? Because the
Mm-hmm.
US did not exist in its current form. But so
Mm-hmm.
that's actually a
Mm-hmm.
curious thing to think about. The ways in which so this behavior, the policy obviously happened after the United States had been formed, the boarding school policy,
Right.
but the original violation didn't. And so
Mm-hmm.
to what degree do the countries from which the settlers came actually
Mm-hmm.
bear the responsibility for the apology or the reparations to Native and Indigenous Americans vis-a-vis people who live in the United States, right? Like I realize it's all blended and we're
Mm-hmm.
all descendants and stuff. I get that.
Mm-hmm.
But to like cut out those original countries,
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of interesting. I mean, granted, I haven't done extensive research on that, but what are your thoughts on that? Do
Mm-hmm.
you think like the Englands, the Scotlands, the Irelands, the France, the Spain, I'm sure, right? Like, do those countries all
Mm-hmm.
together bear some responsibility for both an apology and a reparation of some kind?
Oh, of course. But I also think, yes. So I say yes to your question. And at the very same time, the United States still becomes a branch on that larger tree, right? Where we gave place to the continuation of those thoughts, behaviors, actions. In
Yeah,
fact,
yeah,
I feel like we are the worst predator because all we did was duplicate much behavior that we were fleeing, if we're just
yeah.
talking about specifically the
Mm-hmm.
United States. And so,
Mm-hmm.
what's that phrase? If you don't know your history, you're bound to repeat it. We intentionally repeated that shit, and now it's, oh, let's point the blame at everybody else. And so, I do think that there is a larger tree of responsibility, and at the same time, what was it? I heard a phrase the other day that said, "A a fool learns from his own mistakes, whereas a wise man learns from the mistakes of others." And I'm
Hmm.
like, the United States didn't learn too much in this area.
No.
We literally perpetuated, we duplicated what was already there. And so I I hear you, and I do believe that those branches on that tree
Mm,
have responsibility, yet at the same time, I don't want, given that apologies are so far and few
right.
between from this country, I don't want the US pointing at another country to
No.
try to deflect from what we need to be doing because we got some shit we got to clean up over here.
Mm-hmm.
So I do think there is responsibility, but I don't want it to divert from the accountability that the US rarely takes.
Yeah, so I guess in this instance, this US policy of forced separation in boarding schools that
Mm-hmm.
resulted in the death of nearly 1,000 children, or probably more
Mm-hmm.
actually, that are unaccounted for,
Mm-hmm.
that's very solidly, right, in the United States,
Mm-hmm.
and the federal government's decision making there. But it's one stone or pebble in this
Mm-hmm.
larger mosaic that is violence against indigenous peoples the world over, right? So,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's a good point of clarification, Shauna, to say that you don't want kind of this larger recognition of other countries'
Yeah.
involvement to detract from
Mm-hmm.
what the United States did, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
after
And
expounding beyond. Yeah.
yeah, and the other thing I was thinking about too, since we did go back to the reparation conversation that we had before, is that you're right. We're not talking about the larger universe of every single tribe that has been used, abused, obliterated by the United States of America. But at the same time, wouldn't this be an interesting sample size of individuals, 1,000 or around about 1,000 families that we then use the models that we talked about before in regard to reparations in other countries, especially South Africa? What would it mean to not have a large universe, but a smaller universe with which to apply any system of reparation as an opportunity to demonstrate that it can work?
Well, but the federal government did that with Japanese Americans in the internship camps, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's a smaller sample too. But
Mm-hmm.
what I think will happen is, to your point, Shauna, is with Japanese Americans, was FDR was very clearly within the realm
Yeah.
of the United States of America, right? But the boarding school policy, sure, but I could see the argument being, well, that wasn't really the USA that stole the
Right.
land and committed, that was people from Europe. I could see that argument creeping in there,
It's always
um,
somebody else's fault.
as a
Always.
way to say that reparations don't apply, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yep.
Not only is it
Exactly.
not your fault or my fault, Shauna, that happened back when, back in the 1600s,
Mm-hmm.
whatever, um,
That's
it
right.
also wasn't really us because it was those people from over there, from
Mm-hmm.
across the Atlantic that did that. That's where I
Exactly.
could see it going. So I don't
Exactly.
know. I mean, it's all bullshit, right? It's all just an avoidance of taking responsibility and accountability for the pain and harm and theft.
Mm.
So it's all,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, yeah.
Go ahead and say it's stupid. I love when you say that. Just say it. Just say
It's
it.
stupid. It's just stupid.
See? There you go. See? You
Yeah.
got that off your chest. Exactly. And I concur 100%. Yeah. Oh, goodness. All right. Phase three. Phase three. What's going on in phase three, Lisa?
So phrase three is a little less heavy, a little less deep. So we're lightening it up
Mm-hmm.
here. So Meta, the company, Zuckerberg's company that owns Facebook and Instagram and Threads and such, recently fired about 24 people from their Los Angeles office because these individuals misused their meal credit. So I guess Meta provides their employees a certain amount of credit with Uber Eats or a similar food delivery service for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Those employees that work in some of their bigger locations just have a free canteen, right? But if you don't work in a location where that free canteen is available, you get these meal vouchers or credits. Anyway, there were at least 24 people that had been chronically abusing these credits, including using their credits to buy toothpaste wine glasses, other kind of personal hygiene items, or perhaps they weren't at work and they just used their credit at home to order dinner for themselves and their family. So the piece of this that I think is most jarring is that the folks that were doing this, buying the wine glasses or the toothpaste, these folks are earning over $400,000 a year. So it's not like they needed financially the support to buy the toothpaste and use the meal credit. It was just like a kind of blatant egregious violation of the policy. So I originally was like, do I really care about this? Like, does it really matter? But I think it's an interesting commentary on a company's desire to make work in the office, if that's what they're going to require, more comfortable and more amenable for people. And we know that if you eat well, you can be more productive and you're happier, right? Like, the food for the brain, etc. But then to have a number of employees violate that feels icky. I don't know. What say you, Shaunna, about this little drama at Meta?
Yes, little drama, little drama. Well, not everyone that was found doing this was let go. Some of them got a warning because they just had a smaller infraction and so forth. Um, and so, I tried to put on my business owner hat here, right? So if I'm a business owner, and I am one of those companies that's expecting folks to come back to the office or work in a physical office on my campus, at my campus, in my offices, then I'm attempting to make that more convenient for you. I even have a friend of mine who now is able to literally every morning when they walk into their office, they can fill out a form because they can order their food and have lunch delivered to them in between meetings or whatever time they designate, that type of thing. It's for the convenience of it so you can more comfortably work. And based on Meta's description of this, this is also for folks that are not at their home office, but at some of the more, how can I say, more remote offices that may not have food just right there or nearby or in a place where you don't need to get in a car and drive somewhere. The amount of time that it would take you to get the food was much longer than what it should be. And so just how can we be more productive with this? And so with that, I think part of it is how do we make sure we don't end up on this slippery slope of abuse of the gift that has been given? And at the same time, how do we acknowledge that there's the generosity is there and there's always going to be at least some level of abuse of that generosity, whatever that looks like. And so it's this fine line. And it wasn't like, and I know cost of living is different everywhere, but it wasn't like these were small amounts. I mean, I don't think I would go anywhere and eat $20 worth of food for breakfast, but maybe I would, depending on where I live. I don't know. But it just seemed to be a good amount. And so I guess my question now, Lisa, is what happens when the voucher isn't used? Because the assumption by the employees was that if I don't use it for at least something, then it would be wasted. And I certainly don't want to waste it. And so why not buy the toothpaste or whatever it is, right? So the question that needs to be answered, I think, too, is that, okay, yes, I'll use it, especially when I need it. But if I don't, is that being wasteful of the resource? And can you explain to me what happens if I don't use it? Or does it carry over? Or can I give it to someone else who might need it because they're working, extra hours a specific week, whatever it is? Um, I think it's interesting because it does feed into some obvious areas of socioeconomic-ish things. And I think that going back to our many, many, many conversations about journalism and reporting, it was very interesting to me that like the first couple of paragraphs of this report led with an employee that earned 400K a year, it may seem extremely I don't know, wasteful, untrustworthy for someone who's making 400K a year to quote unquote waste a 20, 40, $60 voucher. They didn't lead with someone that makes minimum wage. I think that was intentional. So I don't know. I think it's a great attempt
Yeah.
to
Mm-hmm.
level the playing field isn't the right phrase, but it's a great attempt to accommodate folks. Yet at the same time, there's always going to be a small number. So now, Lisa, we need to get in, put our data hat on. There's 24 people that were fired out of how many?
Yeah.
After how
Yeah.
long of an investigation? After the frequency? How many times had this
Right.
occurred? Because it clearly didn't happen just one time. They did an
Mm-hmm.
investigation and saw multiple times. And so I think I need more information. And so nice try, Meta, but
Yeah, that is a curious way to think
dot,
about
dot,
it.
dot.
Like, because it was reported in the Financial Times, right? So, but now
Mm-hmm.
I'm just thinking about what you had said earlier
Mm-hmm.
around cost of living and $20 for breakfast. I'm thinking Los Angeles, right? $400,000 in Los Angeles, or I think it's like Menlo Park where they're at. Like, that might actually not be a particularly high salary, but if you abstract $400,000 out of the location where the person is earning it, it sounds a lot, right? So if I'm living in the middle of Nebraska and I'm earning $400,000 a year, then I'm literally rolling in it, right? Because the cost of living is so much less. But in places like San Francisco and Los Angeles, when you can't, like the cheapest, one bedroom apartment home is like $800,000 or something like that, um, maybe 400,000 isn't. So to your point about how it was reported, they did name Los Angeles, but it wasn't prominent, right? And it led with the 400 like as a shock, like as a purposeful riling up of people who earn less. Like, so do you think it was intended to bait people who are reading the piece who don't earn $400,000 to get angry at
Mm.
Zuckerberg or Meta employees for being entitled and ungrateful?
Mm. Oh, now see, now that's interesting because possibly it could have been a bait. And at the same time, how many times have we heard or read articles where they're applauding the generosity of Meta, of things that they've done in the past, and they didn't lead with the earnings. Like it out of the
Mm-hmm.
24 people fired, it literally could have been one person that made 40K and everybody else made
Right. Could be.
way less. So
Yep.
I I feel like a conspiracy theorist because I think it's curious and intentional, yet at the same time, I can't say that I disagree with the policy around the use of the credit.
Right.
I
Yeah.
still think I agree with that.
I mean, do you think it rises to the level of theft to use money that is designated specifically for food while you're working in the office and then you use it for something else that's not related to working in the office? Do you say that's tantamount to theft?
I with my business hat on, absolutely. Because
Mm-hmm.
it's allocated in a way that it shouldn't be.
Mm-hmm.
If I give Lisa company money to go buy pins and she goes buy herself Starbucks, then that's not what it was designated for. And so
Right.
you took it to get something that wasn't approved.
Mm-hmm.
And so we would say something similarly if someone was given this amount of professional development money and they went on vacation with it. That was not
Right.
the intention of the funds as given. And so, yeah, I do think it could be, but they're not seeing it as theft because, again, they're thinking not about where it's coming from. They're thinking about, if I don't use it, then I will lose it, or
Yeah.
it's pretty much devalued what was given to me. And so that's why I do think that, yeah, there's some people that are going to abuse the policy. But on the other hand, for those that sincerely thought, well, hey, I was supposed to use it, and if I don't, then is that being wasteful of the resource?
Right. Yeah, so there's a lot of
They need
context that
more
wasn't in the
information.
piece. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Because I
Yeah.
could
Yeah.
say, well, you're then Uber Eats just pockets this money if I don't use it. So then you're just like giving money to Uber Eats, and that wasn't the intention. So I'm going to
Hmm.
use it, right? That feels very different than some other
Yeah.
kind of less gracious reason. But that wasn't in the news story. So I do think this is interesting because
Yeah.
it definitely pulls in these themes of socioeconomic
Hmm.
status and entitlement and choices that we make in the workplace, both as
Hmm.
employees and employers to create comfort, and
Hmm.
what we do or not take advantage of. Because how many people take pens out of the office, right?
Or paper or
Yeah.
whatever it is, or push
Mm-hmm.
pins or post-it notes or whatever it
Yep.
is.
Yep. Right.
So, is that, I mean, yeah, technically it is considered using something for the purpose that it was not intended.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So, but on the other hand, it's like, okay, if I order something, like if I go right now and order some food from Uber Eats and I ask them to stop at wherever and get a bunch of drinks, and oh, by the way, can you throw a tube of toothpaste in there? I'm still
Right.
using Uber Eats and I'm trying to use it up to my, whatever my upper
Mm-hmm.
threshold
Mm-hmm.
of purchasing is, because I don't want to give the money back to Uber. Is that okay or not? Like we used to do that in college all the time,
Yeah.
where you had your dining dollars or whatever it was, and you really didn't want anything else to eat. It's the end of the semester. The money is going to go to waste. So I'll just go down and buy $100 worth of drinks to put in my room. Well, you're trying to use it within the
Yeah.
parameters. You weren't able to
Yeah.
go buy toothpaste with it, but you're trying not
Mm-hmm.
to be wasteful. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think there should be more context, and I do think there's an intentionality to that 400K somewhat leading the story here.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's some maybe some nefarious. I don't know which way the Financial Times swings. I think it might be more right of center, and I know that Zuckerberg is not really a darling of the right because of some of his perspectives and behaviors with
Mm-hmm.
his platforms. So it will be curious to see if there was some additional motivation there. Well, we'll never be able to find
Mm-hmm.
that out. But
Mm-hmm.
anyway, with that,
Yeah.
I think we'll
Yeah.
call it a day for this week. So, where
Yeah.
can folks find us, Shauna, between now and when we our next episode drops?
Yeah. So folks can surely find us on YouTube at Unfazed Unedited. Like we mentioned, now that Spotify is letting folks work from home because they're not children, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcast, of course, on Instagram at Unfazed Pod, LinkedIn at Unfazed Pod, and of course, you can email us if you have questions or if you have a word that you want us to define for you. Info at unfazedpodcast.com. And of course, all things podcast can be found at unfazedpodcast.com. The old and the new episodes can be found there. So please like, subscribe, leave a review, and share with your friends, coworkers, or others in this phase of your life. So, Lisa, until next week.
Until next week.